A giant cowboy bought an abandoned cabin for 50 cents, but inside he found a secret no one dared to open. The wind howls through broken boards. Dust swirls across a lonely trail. A church bell tolls in the distance. This wasn't just a cheap shack in the mountains. This cabin carried a hidden past. Buried beneath its floor lay a locked chest, with a deed promising the land not to him, but to a starving widow and her children. Now, every step he takes draws the eyes of a ruthless cattle baron. Deputies rattle their jail keys, hooves thunder in the night, and whispers spread. Will the giant cowboy stand with the widow, or be crushed beneath the power of the ranchers who want her gone? The cabin was sold for 50 cents, but its secret may cost everything. What happens when one man's courage collides with greed, hatred, and the broken promises of the frontier? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Red Butte's dusty main street as Christian Bear Kincaid guided his horse between the weathered buildings. His broad shoulders and towering frame drew curious glances from townsfolk hurrying home for supper, but Christian kept his eyes forward, studying the way ahead. The steady clip-clop of his horse's hooves echoed off the wooden sidewalks. His mount's shoes needed attention. He'd have to see the blacksmith soon. But first he had other business to attend to. The courthouse stood proud at the end of the street, its red brick walls glowing warm in the sunset light. A small crowd had already gathered on the steps, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. Christian dismounted slowly, his joints stiff from long days in the saddle. He looped his reins around the hitching post and adjusted his dusty hat before joining the assembly. "Next up for auction," called the court clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, "is the old line shack cabin up near Timberline. Property includes 2 acres. He cleared his throat. "Starting bid at 50 cents. A ripple of uneasy murmurs passed through the crowd. Christian noticed how folks shifted their weight and avoided looking directly at the clerk. Something about that cabin made them nervous. 50 cents. Christian called out in his deep, quiet voice. The sound carried easily across the courthouse steps despite its softness. Heads turned. Several people stepped back to get a better look at him. Christian kept his eyes on the clerk, ignoring the stares. He'd grown used to that kind of attention. A man his size tended to draw notice wherever he went. 50 cents once, the clerk announced, peering over his glasses at the gathered crowd. 50 cents twice. A short, barrel-chested man in a fancy vest leaned toward his neighbor. Let him have it. Christian heard him whisper. That place is cursed, sure as sunrise. Nobody's lasted more than a month up there. Sold. The clerk's gavel came down with a sharp crack. To the gentleman in the back for 50 cents. Chuckles and whispers followed Christian as he made his way forward to claim the deed. He pulled 2 quarters from his pocket and placed them carefully in the clerk's palm. The paper he received in return was yellowed and creased, but the ink was still clear enough to read. Much obliged, Christian said softly, folding the deed and tucking it into his shirt pocket. He touched the brim of his hat to the clerk and turned away, boots scuffing against the wooden steps as he descended. Behind him, the laughter grew louder. Hope you know what you're getting into, mister, someone called out. That place ain't fit for man nor beast. Christian didn't respond. He'd heard similar warnings before, in other towns. Sometimes a man had to make his own luck, curse or no curse. The livery stable was quiet when he led his horse inside. A few other mounts dozed in their stalls, and the sweet smell of fresh hay filled the air. The stable boy, a freckled youngster of about 12, looked up from his sweeping. Evening, mister, the boy said. Need a stall for the night? Christian nodded. "If you've got one free. And some extra feed if you can spare it." The boy pointed to an empty stall. "That one's clean. Feed's 2 bits extra." Christian handed over the coins and began unsaddling his horse. His movements were practiced and gentle, each piece of tack carefully placed on the stall door. The horse nickered softly as Christian curry-combed his coat, working out the trail dust. "Heard you bought old Jim Wheeler's cabin," the stable boy said, leaning on his broom. "Up by Timberline." "That's right." Christian kept brushing, working his way down the horse's flanks. "Ain't nobody lived there since." The boy hesitated. "Well, since what happened to Jim and his family?" Christian paused in his grooming. "What happened? Don't rightly know the whole story. Was before my time." The boy shuffled his feet. "But folks say there's something wrong with that place. Something that drives people away." Christian resumed brushing. "Reckon I'll find out for myself tomorrow." The boy's eyes widened. "You're really gonna live up there?" "That's the plan." Christian finished grooming and gave his horse a final pat. "Been drifting long enough. Time to put down some roots." After checking that his horse was settled with hay and water, Christian spread his bedroll in the corner of an empty stall. The livery's roof would keep off the night dew, and he'd slept in far worse places during his years on the trail. As darkness fell outside, Christian lay back on his saddle, using it as a pillow. Through gaps in the stable's walls, he could see stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. Tomorrow he'd ride up to see his new property, 50 cents worth of hope and possibility. Sleep came slowly. Christian's mind kept turning over the townspeople's reactions, the whispered warnings, the talk of a curse. But underneath those thoughts ran a deeper current of certainty. This was right. This was where he needed to be. The first grey light of dawn was seeping through the stable walls when Christian woke. He rose quietly, not wanting to disturb the other horses. His own mount greeted him with a soft whicker, already alert and ready for the day's journey. Christian took his time saddling up, checking each strap and buckle with care. The morning air was cool and fresh when he led his horse out into the street. Red Butte was still mostly asleep, though smoke already rose from the hotel's kitchen chimney. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks catching the first rays of sunrise. Somewhere up there, waiting in the timber, was his cabin. Christian touched the deed in his pocket, then swung into the saddle. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he'd face them. It was time to see what 50 cents could buy a man who wasn't afraid of hard work, or of whispered curses. His horse's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as they headed out of town. Christian kept to an easy pace, giving both of them time to warm up for the climb ahead. The valley spread out behind him as they gained elevation, Red Butte's buildings shrinking to toy size in the distance. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last wisps of dawn fog. Christian studied the changing landscape as they rode. The grass grew sparser here, giving way to scattered pines and patches of bare rock. A hawk circled overhead, riding the warming air currents. These were good mountains, Christian decided. Strong and ancient, but not unfriendly to those who approached them with respect. The kind of place where a man could build something lasting if he was willing to work for it. The trail narrowed as it wound higher into the timber. Christian's horse picked its way carefully around exposed roots and loose stones. The air grew thinner, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and sun-warmed rock. Ahead, through a break in the trees, Christian caught his first glimpse of what 50 cents had bought him. The cabin's roof sagged in the middle, and one corner of the foundation had settled, giving the whole structure a slightly twisted look. But the logs were thick and solid, built to withstand mountain winters. Christian dismounted and ground-tied his horse in a patch of grass. He approached the cabin slowly, taking in every detail. The The door hung crooked on one hinge. Most of the window glass was broken. Weeds grew thick around the foundation stones. But underneath the neglect, he could see the bones of a good home. The location was well chosen, with a spring-fed creek nearby and enough flat ground for a small garden. The surrounding timber would provide firewood and building materials. Christian circled the cabin, making mental notes of what needed fixing first. The roof would have to be his priority. Winter came early at this elevation. Then the foundation, the door, the windows. It would take time and hard work, but he could make this place livable again. A sudden breeze stirred the treetops, sending shadows dancing across the cabin's weathered walls. Christian paused, listening, but there was nothing unusual in the mountain sounds around him, just wind in the pines, the distant call of a jay, his horse's occasional snort as it grazed. If there was a curse on this place, it wasn't showing itself yet. Christian smiled slightly and pulled the deed from his pocket, unfolding it carefully. His property now, for better or worse. 50 cents had bought him a chance at something he'd been searching for through all his years of drifting. A place to belong. A place to call home. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines as Christian guided his horse up the final stretch of trail. His new property lay nestled against the mountainside, the cabin's weathered logs blending into the surrounding timber. As he drew closer, the full extent of the building's neglect became clear. The roof sagged deeply in the middle like a worn-out saddle. Loose shingles rattled in the mountain breeze, and patches of bare wood showed where others had blown away entirely. The window frames gaped empty, only a few jagged shards of glass still clinging to the edges. The front porch listed to one side where support posts had rotted through. A group of coyotes lounged on the warped porch boards, soaking up the autumn sunshine. At Christian's approach, they scattered like smoke, melting into the surrounding brush with barely a sound. Their presence explained the gnawed bones littering the ground. The cabin had served as their den for some time. Christian dismounted and secured his horse to a sturdy pine. The animal's ears flicked nervously, nostrils flaring at the lingering scent of the coyotes. Christian patted its neck reassuringly before turning to face his purchase. "Well," he murmured, "reckon 50 cents bought me quite a project." The door hung crooked on one remaining hinge, scraping against the threshold as Christian pushed it open. The interior was dim, dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light that penetrated the gloom through gaps in the roof. Cobwebs draped every corner like tattered lace, their builders long gone. The cabin consisted of a single room, perhaps 15 feet square. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney miraculously still standing straight despite the building's general deterioration. A crude plank table leaned against another wall, accompanied by a single three-legged stool. The rest of the space was empty save for debris, leaves blown in through broken windows, scattered pine cones dropped by squirrels, more coyote-gnawed bones. Christian moved carefully across the floor, testing each board before putting his full weight on it. Most seemed solid enough, though here and there his boot would sink slightly into softening wood. He'd need to replace several sections before winter set in. As he approached the rear corner, a hollow sound under his feet made him pause. He tapped his boot again. The hollow knock was unmistakable, different from the solid thunk of boot on timber. Kneeling, Christian ran his fingers along the floorboards, searching for edges or seams. There, a barely perceptible gap between two boards, slightly wider than the others. He worked his pocket knife into the space and pried upward. The board came loose with a protesting creak, revealing a dark cavity beneath the floor. Christian reached into his saddlebags for the stub of candle he kept for emergencies. By its weak light, he could make out a wooden chest nestled in the space below. It was about the size of a Bible box, crafted from sturdy oak with iron bindings. A heavy padlock secured the hasp. "Now what have we here?" Christian muttered, lifting the chest from its hiding place. Decades of dust coated its surface, but the wood beneath remained solid. The lock was badly rusted. Whatever secrets the chest held had been hidden for many years. Christian retrieved the hatchet from his saddle. A few sharp blows to the corroded lock shattered it, sending pieces skittering across the floor. He brushed away the rust fragments and carefully lifted the lid. The contents were wrapped in oilcloth, surprisingly well preserved despite their long concealment. Christian unwrapped the bundle with careful fingers. A stack of letters emerged, tied with faded string, the paper yellow with age but still intact. Beneath them lay a Bible, its leather cover cracked and weathered. Loose papers protruded from between its pages, handwritten notes in faded ink. At the bottom of the chest, Christian found a folded document. He opened it slowly, mindful of the brittle paper. Official letterhead emerged, followed by formal legal language. It was a deed, but not the hastily scrawled bill of sale he'd received at the auction. This was a proper document, dated 15 years earlier, bearing an official seal. As Christian read, his hands grew still. The deed granted full ownership of the cabin and surrounding 5 acres to Morning Star, widow of John Yellowhawk, and her minor children Daniel and Clara Yellowhawk. The document bore the signatures of both the county clerk and an Indian agency representative. Christian sat back on his heels, the deed heavy in his hands. The afternoon light had faded while he examined the chest's contents. Through the broken windows, he could see the sun settling behind the mountains, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. He lit his lantern, setting it on the crooked table. In its yellow glow, he began examining the letters. They told a story in fragments. Correspondence between John Yellowhawk and various officials, attempting to secure the property rights for his family. The man had served as a scout for the army, the letters revealed, earning commendations for his service. He'd used that record to petition for the right to claim land away from the reservation, wanting a better life for his children. The Bible's margins contained careful notes in 2 different hands. One was firm and precise, likely John Yellowhawk's. The other was softer, more flowing, perhaps his widow's. Both had marked passages about justice, about caring for the fatherless, about the strength to endure hardship. Christian spread the documents on the table, the lantern light gleaming on the official seals and signatures. His 50-cent purchase price felt like bitter copper in his mouth. This place hadn't been abandoned. It had been taken, through whatever legal sleight of hand allowed the county to auction it, despite a valid prior claim. Somewhere out there was a woman named Morning Star, with 2 children who should have inherited their father's hard-won property. Instead, they'd lost their home, their security, their birthright. And Christian had unknowingly become part of that injustice for the price of 50 cents. The lantern flame wavered as a night breeze slipped through the broken windows. Outside, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing off the mountainside. Christian stared at the scattered papers, wrestling with his conscience. He'd wanted roots, a place to belong, but not like this, not built on someone else's loss. The deed in his hands was more than just a piece of paper. It was a father's dream for his children's future, a widow's rightful inheritance, a family's claim to a piece of God's country earned through service and sacrifice. Christian remained at the table as full darkness settled over the cabin. The lantern's circle of light held him and the chest's contents in a small island of illumination, while shadows gathered in the corners. His fingers traced the signatures on Morning Star's deed again and again, as if seeking guidance in their faded ink. In the morning, he would have to decide what to do about his discovery. But for now, he sat vigil with the evidence of one family's shattered hopes, while crickets sang in the grass outside and stars wheeled slowly overhead. The chest's contents lay spread before him in the lantern light, the letters recording a father's fight for his family's future, the Bible filled with carefully noted wisdom, and most importantly, the deed that proved where justice truly lay. Christian's 50-cent bill of sale felt like a worthless scrap in comparison to the weight of what he'd found beneath those floorboards. The sun crept over the eastern horizon, painting the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold. Christian stood on the cabin's crooked porch, watching dawn spread across the valley below. He'd slept little, the weight of his discovery keeping rest at bay. The deed and letters lay carefully wrapped in his saddlebags now, protected from the morning damp. His horse nickered softly as Christian approached with saddle and blanket. "Reckon we've got some miles ahead of us, old friend," he murmured, settling the gear in place. The animal's coat gleamed in the early light, refreshed from a night of grazing in the meadow grass. From one of the letters, Christian had found directions to the reservation agency, a settlement some 15 miles east, where Cheyenne families lived under government supervision. The writer had described landmarks, a lightning-struck pine marking the trail fork, 3 distinctive rock spires rising above a creek bend, an old military road cutting through red clay hills. The morning air bit sharp and clean as Christian rode down from the cabin's elevation. His breath fogged in front of him, mixing with his horses as they picked their way along the rough trail. Wind whistled down from the ridgelines, carrying the scent of snow from higher peaks, though autumn had barely begun to turn the aspen leaves golden. By mid-morning, the trail led him through rolling ranch country. Clusters of cattle grazed on the autumn-cured grass, their hides bearing the distinctive MB brand of Mason Burke's spread. Christian had heard talk in town about Burke's empire, how it grew year by year, absorbing smaller holdings through means that weren't always clear. The sense of being watched prickled at Christian's neck. Twice he caught glimpses of riders on distant ridges, their shapes dark against the sky. Burke's men, no doubt, keeping watch over their employer's interests. Christian kept his pace steady, his manner unconcerned, though his awareness stayed sharp. The sun had passed its peak when Christian finally spotted the agency settlement in a protected valley. A cluster of wooden buildings marked the official presence: the agent's house, a small store, a one-room schoolhouse. Beyond these, canvas teepees and more permanent log dwellings spread out along the creek, smoke rising from cooking fires into the afternoon air. Christian drew his horse to a halt, taking in the scene. Children played in the dusty spaces between dwellings, their shouts and laughter carrying on the wind. Women moved between the homes, carrying water or firewood, some in traditional dress, others in simpler cotton garments. A few men sat in the shade, watching his approach with careful expressions. Near one of the log homes, a woman stood stirring a pot suspended over a fire. Her long black hair was tied back with a beaded band, her movements sure and practiced as she tended her cooking. 2 children darted around her, a boy of perhaps 10 years and a younger girl, their play taking them in spiraling paths through the settlement's open spaces. Christian dismounted, leading his horse forward on foot. He'd learned enough about Cheyenne customs to know that charging in on horseback would be seen as aggressive, disrespectful. As he approached, several of the men straightened, their attention sharpening. "I'm looking for Morning Star," Christian said, keeping his voice pitched low and steady. "Widow of John Yellowhawk." The woman at the fire went still, her stirring spoon suspended. The children's game carried them back toward her, and they pressed close to her skirts, studying Christian with wide eyes. The boy's stance was protective, though curiosity showed in his face. The girl half hid behind her mother, one hand clutching the worn fabric of her dress. "I am Morning Star." Her voice was clear and dignified, though Christian could see the wariness in her dark eyes. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30 years old, with a beauty that transcended her simple dress and work-reddened hands. Christian inclined his head respectfully. "Ma'am, my name's Christian Kincaid. I've come about your cabin, the one up near Timberline." Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That place is lost to us now. If you've come to mock—" "No, ma'am," Christian interrupted gently. He reached into his saddlebags, drawing out the wrapped package of documents. "I've come because I found something that belongs to you." He held out the deed first, unfolding it carefully. Morning Star didn't move to take it, so he began to read. "This document grants full ownership of the cabin and surrounding 5 acres to Morning Star, widow of John Yellowhawk, and her minor children, Daniel and Clara Yellowhawk." The boy, Daniel, pressed closer to his mother, his eyes fixed on the paper. Clara's small face peered around Morning Star's skirt, hope warring with uncertainty in her expression. "Where did you get this?" Morning Star's voice was tight with suppressed emotion. Christian explained about the auction, the hollow floorboard, the hidden chest. As he spoke, he could see Morning Star's shoulders straightening, pride and pain mingling in her bearing. Her children watched him intently, absorbing every word. "The chest contained letters too," Christian continued, drawing them out. "Your husband's correspondence with the Army and Indian Agency, and a Bible with notes in the margins." Morning Star's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the Bible. She opened it carefully, fingers tracing the familiar handwriting on its pages. "John's words," she whispered. "He wrote here of his hopes for our children's future." "They said the cabin was abandoned," Daniel burst out suddenly. "They said we had no right to it anymore." "Who did, son?" Christian asked quietly. "Men from town. They came with papers, said we had to leave." The boy's fists clenched at his sides. "Papa earned that place. He worked for the army, helped them make peace with our people." Morning Star laid a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "Enough, Daniel." But her eyes when they met Christian's were hard with remembered injustice. "Why have you brought these to us? What do you want?" It was a fair question. Christian chose his words carefully. "I bought that cabin at auction for 50 cents, not knowing its history. But now that I do know, I can't keep what rightfully belongs to you and your children." "Pretty words," Morning Star said. "We have heard many pretty words before." "Yes, Mum, I expect you have." Christian held out the stack of documents. "But these aren't just words. They're legal proof of your ownership. The county had no right to auction that property. It belongs to you and your children by law and by right." Morning Star still didn't take the papers. "And what do you ask in return?" "Nothing, Ma'am. Only the chance to make right what was done wrong." Clara tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mama? Can we go home? To Papa's cabin?" Morning Star's face softened as she looked down at her daughter. When she raised her eyes to Christian again, some of the guardedness had eased. "You are certain these papers are real?" "Not some cruel trick. They bear official seals, ma'am. The signatures of the county clerk and Indian agent. I reckon they're as real as documents get." Finally, slowly, Morning Star reached out and took the papers from Christian's hands. She examined them carefully, her children pressed close on either side. Christian waited patiently, giving them time to absorb the reality of what he'd brought. "The cabin needs work," he said after a while. "Windows broken, roof wanting repair, but the bones are sound. It could be a good home again with some effort." Morning Star looked up sharply. "You have seen inside?" "Yes, Ma'am. Spent last night there after finding these." He gestured to the documents she held. "It's how I came to discover them." She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. The afternoon light was beginning to soften toward evening, casting long shadows across the settlement. Around them, life continued. Women preparing evening meals, children being called in from play, men gathering for quiet conversation. Daniel spoke up again, his voice careful but hopeful. "Mama?" "What are we going to do?" Morning Star drew both children closer, one arm around each of them. Her eyes met Christian's, measuring him carefully. The wariness hadn't entirely left her gaze, but something else had joined it, a cautious consideration of possibilities. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and sage across the settlement. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called its evening song. Christian waited, giving Morning Star the space to make her own decision about the unexpected gift he'd brought, the chance to reclaim what had been wrongfully taken from her family. Christian shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking softly. "I came by that cabin honest enough at auction, but I can't keep what ain't rightfully mine, not when I know the truth of it." Morning Star's expression remained carefully neutral, but her fingers tightened on the papers she held. The evening shadows lengthened around them, painting the settlement in soft purple light. A cooking fire crackled nearby, sending wood smoke curling into the darkening sky. "My husband," she said at last, her voice steady despite the pain Christian could hear beneath the words, "was a scout for the army. He believed in building peace between our peoples." She glanced down at her children, who stayed close by her side. "He served with honor, helped prevent bloodshed more than once. The army promised him this land in return." Daniel's young face hardened. "But then Papa died." Morning Star nodded slowly. "Yes, he took fever during a winter patrol. The agency doctor could not save him." Her dark eyes met Christian's. When I tried to claim our property, there were difficulties." "The ranchers!" Daniel burst out, then fell silent at his mother's gentle touch on his shoulder. "Burke and his men," Morning Star explained. "They said no Indian woman could own land so close to their grazing ranges. They blocked our way, threatened us. When I went to town for help, the officials claimed our papers were lost." Her lip curled slightly. How convenient, that loss. Clara tugged at her mother's skirt, her small face hopeful as she looked at the deed in Morning Star's hands. "But now we have the papers again, Mama." "We can go home?" Morning Star shook her head, though Christian saw how it pained her to dim the hope in her daughter's eyes. "We have been fooled before, little one." Pretty promises that turned to dust. "No fooling here, Ma'am," Christian said quietly. "Those are your legal documents, clear as day, and I aim to see justice done." "Justice." Morning Star's tone was bitter. "What does that word mean when laws bend like grass in the wind?" "It means something to me." Christian met her gaze steadily. "Come see the cabin yourself. Bring the children. I'll drive you up there at first light if you're willing. No tricks, no schemes, just the truth of what's yours by right." The settlement had grown quiet around them as darkness crept in. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its lonely song echoing off the hills. Morning Star stood silent, looking down at the papers that promised her family a home. Clara pressed closer to her mother's side. "Please, Mama." "I remember the cabin, the wild roses that grew by the door." "And the creek," Daniel added eagerly, "where Papa taught me to fish." Morning Star's expression softened as she looked at her children's pleading faces. She turned back to Christian, studying him with eyes that had seen too many broken promises. "You would take us there? Tomorrow?" "Yes, Ma'am. I've got a wagon. We can leave at dawn, be there by mid-morning." She was quiet for another long moment, weighing his words. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Very well. We will come see this cabin, but I make no promises beyond that." "That's fair enough," Christian said. "I'll be here at first light." The next morning dawned clear and cool, with a thin mist rising from the creek bottom. Christian had borrowed a wagon from the livery stable, padding the wooden seat with blankets for comfort. He pulled up to Morningstar's small home just as the sun's first rays touched the eastern hills. They were waiting for him. Morningstar had packed a bundle of provisions: bread, dried meat, a few cooking implements. The children fairly bounced with excitement as Christian helped them up onto the wagon seat. Their mother climbed up more carefully, her face composed but her eyes alert for any sign of deception. "All set?" Christian asked, gathering the reins. Morningstar nodded, settling Clara more securely beside her. The little girl clutched a rag doll to her chest, while Daniel sat straight and tall, trying to contain his eagerness. They set out as the sun cleared the horizon, the wagon's wheels creaking softly on the rutted trail. Christian guided the horses at a steady pace, mindful of his passengers' comfort. The morning air was sweet with sage and early wildflowers, and meadowlarks called from fence posts as they passed. The children's excitement couldn't be contained for long. Soon they were pointing out everything they saw: a hawk wheeling overhead, a family of rabbits bounding through the grass, the distant peaks still touched with snow. Their chatter filled the wagon, though Morningstar remained silent, watching the trail ahead with wary attention. "Look, Mama!" Clara cried suddenly. "Prairie roses like the ones at our cabin." "Hush, little one," Morningstar said softly, but Christian saw how her hands trembled slightly in her lap. The trail began to climb as they entered the foothills. Christian kept the horses steady on the increasing grade, while the children's conversation turned to memories of their former home. "Remember the creek, Clara?" Daniel asked. "How Papa would lift you across the stepping stones." Clara nodded eagerly. "And the butterflies in summer?" So many colors. "The cabin had a good view of the valley," Morningstar said unexpectedly. Her voice was distant, lost in memory. "John said he chose that spot because it reminded him of the old stories, how our people could see for miles from their mountain camps, watching for both danger and blessing." Christian glanced at her. "It's fine country up there. Good water, shelter from the worst winds. Your husband chose well." She didn't respond, but her posture straightened slightly as they continued to climb. The sun rose higher, burning off the morning mist and warming the air. They passed through stands of aspen, their leaves beginning to green with spring, then into the darker shade of pine forest. Daniel leaned forward, scanning the trail ahead. "Are we nearly there?" "Another hour or so," Christian replied. "Trail gets steeper from here." The boy nodded, his expression eager but touched with uncertainty. Clara had grown quieter, pressing closer to her mother's side. Morningstar's face remained carefully neutral, but Christian could sense the tension in her as they drew nearer to their destination. They rounded a bend, and the valley opened up below them, a patchwork of green meadows and dark forest. The children gasped at the view, while Morningstar's hands tightened on the wagon seat. "Burke's ranch is down there," she said softly, indicating a cluster of buildings in the distance. Christian nodded. "His cattle range all through these hills. But this land is yours, legal and proper, no matter what he thinks about it." She turned to study his face. "You sound very certain." "I am certain, Mom. Right is right, and wrong is wrong. Ain't always simple to tell the difference, but in this case, it's clear as mountain water." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, there and gone so quickly Christian wasn't sure he'd seen it. They continued climbing, the horses' hooves striking rock now and then as the trail wound higher. Clara sat up straighter suddenly. "I hear the creek!" Listen, Mama." Sure enough, the sound of rushing water carried through the trees. Morning Star's breath caught audibly, and Daniel's face lit up with recognition. "Almost there," Christian said quietly. They rounded one final bend, and there it was, the cabin set back among the pines, its weather-worn logs glowing golden in the morning light. Wild roses grew tangled by the sagging porch, just as Clara had remembered. The creek tumbled past nearby, its voice a constant song. The wagon wheels crunched to a halt in the small clearing. For a long moment, no one moved. The children stared at their former home with shining eyes, while Morning Star sat very still, her face a mix of emotions Christian couldn't quite read. "It needs work," he said finally, breaking the silence. "But the bones are good. Nothing that can't be fixed with time and effort." Morning Star didn't respond. Instead, she climbed down from the wagon with fluid grace, then helped Clara down beside her. Daniel jumped down on his own, already moving toward the cabin with eager steps. "Wait," his mother called softly. The boy stopped, though Christian could see how it cost him to hold back. Morning Star moved forward slowly, her children close beside her. She mounted the porch steps carefully, testing each one. At the door, she paused, one hand resting on the rough wood. "John carved our names here," she said, fingers tracing letters Christian couldn't see. "The day we first came." Clara pressed against her mother's side. "Can we go in, Mama?" "Please." Morning Star stood silent for another long moment, then turned to look at Christian, who waited respectfully by the wagon. "You truly mean to return this place to us?" she asked. "No conditions? No hidden price to pay?" "No conditions," Christian confirmed. "No price. It's yours by right and law. I'm just setting things straight is all." She studied him carefully, weighing his words against years of broken promises and bitter experience. The mountain breeze stirred her hair, carrying the scent of pine and wild roses. Behind her, the cabin waited, its windows reflecting the morning sun like watchful eyes. Finally, Morning Star gave a small nod. "Very well. We will look inside." Daniel's face broke into a grin, while Clara bounced on her toes in excitement. Their mother reached for the door latch, paused one last time, then pushed it open. Together, the small family stepped across the threshold of their lost home. The sun hung low in the western sky by the time their wagon crested the final ridge. Christian's horses, weary from the long uphill journey, plodded steadily toward the cabin's clearing. The children had grown quiet as evening approached, though their eyes remained bright with anticipation. "Almost there," Christian said softly, guiding the team around a bend in the trail. The cabin's dark shape emerged from the deepening shadows of the pines. Morning Star sat straight-backed beside him, her expression carefully controlled as their destination came into view. Only her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, betrayed her tension. Christian pulled the wagon to a halt near the cabin's front porch. "Let me get a fire going inside first," he said, jumping down from the seat. "Take the chill off before you all come in." He strode to the door, fishing the key from his pocket. Inside, he moved quickly, laying kindling and logs in the stone fireplace. His matches sparked in the gloom, catching the dry wood. Soon, thin wisps of smoke curled up the chimney, carrying the sweet scent of burning pine. Outside, Daniel and Clara had already climbed down from the wagon. Their initial hesitation melted away as they recognized familiar landmarks in the yard. Clara darted toward a gnarled apple tree that still clung to life near the corner of the cabin. "Look, Daniel," she called. "The tree where Papa hung our swing." Daniel followed more slowly, his eyes taking in the weathered walls, the sagging porch, the broken windows. but when his sister grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the creek, his serious expression cracked into a smile. Their laughter rang out across the clearing, echoing off the mountainside. Morning Star remained in the wagon, watching her children rediscover their former home. The last rays of sunlight caught her face, illuminating eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. Christian approached quietly, offering his hand to help her down. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted, descending with quiet dignity. Together they walked to the cabin's entrance. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, wood warped by seasons of snow and rain. Morning Star paused at the threshold, one hand rising to touch the door frame, where faint marks still showed, notches marking her children's growth over the years they'd lived here. Inside, the firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls. Morning Star moved slowly through the single room, her fingers trailing along surfaces that held so many memories. She stopped at the fireplace, crouching to run her hand over the rough-hewn stones. "John gathered these from the creek," she said softly. "Carried them up one by one. Said he wanted the hearth to be strong, to last generations." Her voice caught slightly. "He had such dreams for this place." Christian stood respectfully near the door, giving her space to reconnect with the cabin's history. "Dreams don't have to die," he said quietly. "Place needs work, but nothing that can't be fixed." She turned to look at him, firelight reflecting in her dark eyes. "We will manage," she said firmly. "We have managed before." A clatter from outside drew their attention. Daniel had found Christian's toolbox on the wagon and was attempting to pull out a hammer. The heavy tool slipped in his grip, nearly catching his fingers on a jagged piece of wood. Christian moved quickly, reaching the boy's side in 3 long strides. "Here now," he said gently, taking the hammer. "Let me show you the proper way." He positioned Daniel's hands correctly on the handle. "Like this. Keep your thumb clear of the head, grip firm, but not too tight." The boy nodded earnestly, practicing the motion Christian demonstrated. His mother watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable in the growing dusk. "Perhaps," she said finally, "we could accept some help. For the children's safety." Christian nodded, understanding the concession that statement represented. "Much obliged for the chance to lend a hand." Clara's voice piped up from near the creek. "Mama, I'm hungry." "Then it's time for supper," Morning Star replied, turning back into the cabin. She retrieved her bundle of provisions from the wagon, laying out bread and dried meat on a clean cloth near the fire. Christian contributed his own supplies, beans, coffee, and some dried apples. He hung his battered coffee pot over the flames and set about warming the beans in a shallow pan. Soon, the homey smell of food filled the cabin. The children settled cross-legged near the hearth, their faces glowing in the lamplight Christian had lit against the gathering darkness. Clara hummed softly as she ate, a melody that seemed to blend English hymn with Cheyenne rhythm. Daniel was more focused on his food, but his eyes kept straying to Christian's toolbox, clearly already planning tomorrow's repairs. Morning Star sat with quiet grace, breaking her bread into neat pieces. The firelight softened her features, caught golden in her dark hair. For the first time since Christian had met her, some of the wariness had eased from her shoulders. The cabin's broken windows still let in the evening's chill, but near the fire, warmth gathered like a living thing. It pushed back against the shadows, against the years of emptiness and loss. In that simple meal shared by lamplight, something shifted, not quite healing, not yet, but perhaps the first tender shoot of hope taking root. Clara finished her beans and leaned against her mother's side, eyelids growing heavy. Daniel stifled a yawn, though he tried to sit up straighter when Christian glanced his way. The long day's journey was catching up with them all. "There's fresh straw in the lean-to," Christian said, rising to his feet. "I'll fetch some in, make pallets near the fire. Get you all settled proper for the night." "We have blankets in the wagon," Morningstar replied. She stood as well, gathering the supper things with practiced efficiency. Together they prepared for night, working in companionable silence. Christian brought in armfuls of clean straw while Morningstar arranged blankets. The children helped as they could, though Clara was nearly asleep on her feet by the time the pallets were ready. Through the broken window, stars had begun to appear in the darkening sky. A cool mountain breeze carried the sound of the creek, the distant cry of a night bird. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Morningstar tucked her children into their makeshift beds, smoothing Clara's hair back from her face, adjusting Daniel's blanket over his shoulders. They were asleep almost instantly, worn out by excitement and travel. She straightened, looking around the cabin, at the work that would be needed, at the memories that clung to every corner, at the fresh possibilities that suddenly seemed to hover in the lamplit air. "Thank you," she said quietly to Christian, who was banking the fire for the night, "for bringing us home." He nodded, understanding all that lay behind those simple words. "Get some rest," he replied. "Tomorrow's soon enough to start putting things right." Morningstar settled onto her own pallet, drawing a blanket around her shoulders. Christian took his bedroll out to the porch, leaving the family to their first night back in their own space. The cabin's broken walls still let in the wind, but inside, where the lamplight gleamed softly on sleeping faces, the warmth held steady against the mountain night. Word spread through Red Butte like wildfire on a dry prairie. The saloon buzzed with whispered conversations about the mysterious cabin up in timber country and the Cheyenne family who had returned to claim it. Every newcomer through the swinging doors brought fresh details, each telling growing taller than the last. Mason Burke sat at his usual corner table, a half-empty whiskey bottle before him. His weathered face grew darker with each story that reached his ears. When his foreman pushed through the doors with confirmation of Christian's discovery, Burke's fingers tightened around his glass until his knuckles showed white. "You're certain?" Burke demanded, his voice cutting through the saloon's usual din. "The deed's legitimate?" The foreman nodded, shifting uncomfortably under his boss's hard stare. "Saw it myself from a distance. Army SEAL and everything. That big fellow who bought the cabin at auction found it hidden away." Burke slammed his glass down so hard, whiskey sloshed onto the scarred table. "Damn fool should have burned any papers he found instead of playing hero." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That land borders 3 of my best grazing sections. If that Indian woman gets legal claim, she could shut down my whole operation in that valley." "What do you want us to do, boss?" Burke's eyes narrowed as he poured another drink. "Keep men watching that cabin. Day and night. I want to know every move they make, every visitor they get." He tossed back the whiskey in one swift motion. "And find out everything you can about this Christian fellow. Every man has secrets, or debts, or both." The foreman touched his hat brim and slipped away, leaving Burke to brood over his bottle. Through the grimy window, he could see the mountains rising against the evening sky. His empire stretched across those slopes, an empire built on borrowed money, borrowed time, and other people's lost claims. He wouldn't let one forgotten deed tear it all down. Up at the cabin, life settled into a steady rhythm of work and small victories. Christian rose before dawn each day, heading into the timber with axe and saw. The sound of his chopping echoed through the valley as he cut fresh logs for repairs. His massive shoulders gleamed with sweat in the morning sun as he squared the timber, movements precise despite his size. Daniel followed him everywhere, eager to learn. Christian showed him how to strip bark, how to measure twice before cutting, how to test wood for rot. The boy soaked up every lesson, his small hands growing calloused from honest work. "Like this?" Daniel asked, carefully positioning a hammer over a nail. Christian adjusted his grip slightly. "That's the way." "Remember what I told you about letting the tool do the work? Don't force it." The boy nodded seriously, then drove the nail true with 3 sharp strikes. His face broke into a proud grin when Christian ruffled his hair in approval. Morningstar watched these interactions from the doorway, her expression thoughtful. While the men worked on repairs, she and Clara tended to the small plot they'd cleared for a garden. Her knowledge of plants went far beyond simple vegetables. Each herb and root had a purpose, a healing property passed down through generations. "This one," she explained to Christian one afternoon, holding up a dried root, "helps bring down fever." She pointed to another plant with delicate purple flowers. "And these leaves, crushed and mixed with fat, draw infection from wounds." Christian listened intently, recognizing the value of such knowledge in the isolated mountains. "Much obliged for the teaching," he said quietly. "Knowledge like that could save a life out here." A ghost of a smile touched Morningstar's lips. "Perhaps that is why I share it." The cabin slowly transformed under their combined efforts. Christian replaced broken windows, patched the roof, and rebuilt the sagging porch. Morningstar scrubbed years of grime from the floors and walls, while Clara arranged wildflowers in tin cans along the windowsills. Even the yard showed signs of care: wood neatly stacked, tools properly stored, a path cleared to the creek. But not all eyes watching their progress were friendly. Burke's men kept their distance, but their presence was felt. Horses sometimes spooked at shadows in the trees. Footprints appeared around the spring where they drew water. Christian began sleeping closer to the cabin's door, his rifle within easy reach. One evening, as twilight painted the mountains purple, they sat together on the newly mended porch. The air was cool and sweet with pine. Clara sat on the steps, humming softly to herself as she worked on a string of beads. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a Cheyenne hymn her father had taught her. Morningstar explained. Christian listened, head bowed. Then, almost unconsciously, he began to sing along quietly in English. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." The words blended perfectly with Clara's tune, English and Cheyenne becoming one song. Daniel stopped whittling to listen. Even the crickets seemed to pause. Morningstar turned to look at Christian, surprise clear on her face. In the fading light, she studied him as though truly seeing him for the first time. Not just his impressive size or his capable hands, but something deeper. Something that understood the beauty of 2 cultures touching, like streams joining to form a river. "My ma taught me that hymn," Christian explained softly when the song ended. "Said music speaks straight to the heart, no matter what language it's in." "Your mother was wise," Morningstar replied. She was silent for a moment, then added, "John, my husband, he believed the same. That beauty could bridge any divide." It was the first time she had spoken of her husband without pain sharpening her voice. The mention hung in the air between them, not as a barrier, but as a shared understanding of loss and hope. Clara yawned, breaking the moment. "Time for sleep," Morningstar said, rising gracefully to her feet. She gathered her children, pausing in the doorway. "Thank you," she said to Christian, "for the song. And everything else." Christian nodded, remaining on the porch as the family went inside. The first stars were appearing overhead, bright and clear in the mountain air. He could feel eyes watching from the darkness beyond the clearing, Burke's men keeping their vigil. But here, on this porch, with the sound of Clara's hymn still echoing in his mind and the warmth of Morningstar's gratitude lingering in the air, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years of drifting. He felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Inside, he heard Morningstar's voice speaking softly in Cheyenne as she tucked her children into bed. The cabin's repaired walls glowed with lamplight, holding back the gathering night. Through the window came the mingled scent of pine smoke and the herbs Morningstar had hung to dry: sage, yarrow, wild mint. Every detail spoke of home, of belonging, of something worth protecting. Christian checked his rifle one last time before settling into his bedroll near the door. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more of Burke's silent threats. But tonight, in this moment, peace settled over the cabin like a blanket, warm and real and hard-won. In his corner table at the saloon, Mason Burke continued to brood over his whiskey, plotting ways to protect his empire. But up on the mountain, in a humble cabin growing stronger day by day, a different kind of empire was taking shape, one built not on greed and fear, but on trust, respect, and the quiet power of two worlds coming together in harmony. The moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light on the cabin's new shingled roof. Inside, the family slept peacefully. Outside, Christian kept his watch, as steady and strong as the mountains themselves. In the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that echoed through the valley, carrying no answer but the whisper of wind in the pines. The Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight spilling over the mountain peaks like honey. Christian had been up since before first light, polishing his worn boots and brushing his best shirt free of dust. He stood now by the cabin door, watching Morningstar help Clara smooth her hair into neat braids, while Daniel fidgeted with his collar. "You certain about this?" Morningstar asked quietly, her fingers working deftly through Clara's dark hair. Her own dress, though simple, had been carefully mended and pressed for the occasion. Christian nodded, his voice gentle but firm. "Pastor Whitlow's a good man, and it's time folks in town saw you proper-like, as rightful owners of this land." The wagon ride down the mountain was slow and careful. Christian had lined the bed with fresh hay to make it more comfortable, and the children bounced along excitedly, pointing out rabbits and deer that darted through the morning shadows. Morningstar sat straight-backed beside Christian on the wagon seat, her face composed, but her hands tight in her lap. As they approached the town, the sound of hymns drifted out from the small white clapboard church. Wagon wheels crunched on gravel as other families arrived, their Sunday best bright against the dusty street. Christian guided their wagon to a spot near the hitching post, then reached down to help Morningstar descend. The whispers started immediately. Heads turned, conversations stuttered to a halt. Some faces hardened with disapproval, while others showed surprise or curiosity. Christian stood tall beside Morningstar and her children, his massive frame like a protective wall between them and the stairs. "Welcome, welcome!" Pastor Whitlow's voice rang out clear and warm as he hurried down the church steps. He was a lean man with kind eyes and work-roughened hands that spoke of practicing what he preached. "We're blessed to have you join us today." The pastor's greeting seemed to break the spell. A few of the townspeople nodded in greeting, though others turned away. Christian ushered the family towards the church door, his hand hovering near Morningstar's elbow in silent support. Inside, the church was cool and dim, sunlight filtering through simple glass windows. The wooden pews were well worn, smooth from years of faithful attendance. Christian guided them to a seat near the back, where Morningstar could keep both children close and have a clear view of the door. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, sat in the pew ahead of them. She turned and smiled warmly at Clara, who shyly smiled back. But across the aisle, Hank Miller and his wife deliberately shifted their children further away as though difference might be catching. The service began with familiar hymns. Clara's clear voice joined in naturally. She knew many of the tunes from her father's teaching. Her singing drew surprised glances, then appreciative nods from some of the congregation. Daniel sat up straighter, proud of his sister. When Pastor Whitlow took his place behind the simple wooden pulpit, his eyes swept the congregation with purpose. "Today," he began, his voice carrying to every corner, "we speak of duty. Not the easy duties that bring profit or praise, but the hard duties that test our faith and measure our hearts." Christian felt the weight of the pastor's words settle into his bones. Morning Star sat perfectly still beside him, her face unreadable. In James, we are told that pure religion is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress. Pastor Whitlow continued, "Not just the widows who look like us or speak like us, not just the orphans born to our own kind, all of God's children deserve justice and mercy." The sermon built like a summer storm, powerful and cleansing. The pastor spoke of promises broken and honor lost, of the duty to defend those who could not defend themselves. His words seemed to strike sparks in the quiet church. "When we turn away from the widow's cause," he declared, "when we deny justice to the fatherless, we mock the very God we claim to serve. And make no mistake, God sees, God remembers, and God demands better of his people." Christian sat straighter with each word, feeling the truth of them pierce his heart like arrows. This was why he'd been led to that auction, why he'd found that hidden deed. Not chance, but purpose. Morning Star's children pressed closer to their mother, sensing the importance of the moment even if they didn't grasp all the words. After the final hymn, as the congregation began to disperse, several women approached Morning Star. Mrs. Peterson led the way, carrying a cloth-wrapped loaf of fresh bread. "For the children," she said simply, holding it out. "Still warm from the morning's baking." Morning Star accepted it with quiet dignity. "Thank you," she said softly, her English clear and precise. "You are kind." Other small offerings followed: a jar of preserved peaches, some fresh eggs, a packet of seeds for the garden. Not many, but enough to show that some hearts had been moved by the pastor's words. The morning sun was high and hot when they finally stepped out of the church. Christian helped the children into the wagon, while Morning Star carefully stored the gifts they'd received. But before they could leave, a shadow fell across their path. Mason Burke stood blocking their way, his expensive boots planted firmly in the dust. Two of his ranch hands lounged against a hitching post nearby, trying to look casual while keeping their hands near their gun belts. "Quite a show you put on today, Kincaid," Burke said, his voice pitched to carry to the lingering churchgoers. "Playing protector to savages now, are you?" Christian turned slowly to face him, his own voice quiet but steel-hard. "These are good folks with a legal claim to their land. Nothing savage about wanting what's rightfully yours." "Rightfully?" Burke barked a laugh. "Since when do Indians have rights to prime grazing land? Best not meddle in matters that don't concern you, bear man. Some affairs are best left to those who understand the natural order of things." "Justice concerns everyone," Christian replied evenly. "And the only order I understand is what's right and what's wrong. The law's clear on this one, Burke. That land belongs to Morning Star and her children." Burke's face darkened. He stepped closer, dropping his voice so only Christian could hear. "You're making a mistake, friend." "Big mistake. Man your size ought to know better than to stick his neck out for lost causes." "Only mistake here," Christian said, "is thinking you can bully folks off what's theirs." He straightened to his full height, towering over Burke. "Now, if you'll excuse us. We've got a long ride home." Burke's eyes narrowed to deadly slits. "Home?" He spat. "We'll see about that. He turned on his heel and stalked away, his men falling in behind him like well-trained dogs. The confrontation had drawn attention. Pastor Whitlow stood on the church steps, watching with concern. Other townsfolk lingered, some looking troubled, others thoughtful. The lines were being drawn, and everyone knew it. Christian helped Morning Star up onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. The children huddled close behind them, suddenly quiet. As they pulled away from the church, Morning Star spoke softly in her native tongue, a prayer or perhaps a wish for protection. The wagon wheels kicked up dust as they headed back toward the mountains. Christian held the reins steady, his jaw set with determination. He'd meant every word he'd said to Burke. This was about justice, pure and simple, and whatever came next, he'd stand his ground. Behind them, the church bell tolled once, clear and strong in the summer air. Its sound carried across the valley like a declaration, or perhaps a warning of storms to come. The mountain afternoon settled soft and golden around the cabin. Christian sat on a freshly hewn log, watching Daniel's small hands grip the hammer. The boy's tongue poked out in concentration as he carefully drove another nail into the fence post. "Easy now," Christian guided. "Let the hammer do the work." He demonstrated the smooth motion again, his massive hands dwarfing the tool. Not too hard, not too gentle. Just right. Daniel nodded seriously, adjusting his grip. The next nail went in straight and true. His face lit up with pride. "Like that, Mr. Bear?" "Just like that." Christian ruffled the boy's dark hair. "You're a natural, son. Few more days you'll be teaching me." From the cabin's open door drifted the sound of Clara's voice, singing a hymn while she helped her mother prepare supper. The melody wrapped around them like evening mist, part English, part Cheyenne, wholly beautiful. Christian's shoulders ached from a long day of hauling timber and digging post holes. He rolled them carefully, trying to ease the knots. Morning Star appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her quick eyes missed nothing. "You hurt?" she said simply. It wasn't a question. "Just stiff," Christian replied. "Nothing serious." She disappeared inside, returning moments later with a clay jar. "Come," she instructed, pointing to the cabin's rough-hewn steps. Christian obeyed, lowering himself onto the sun-warmed wood. Morning Star opened the jar, releasing a sharp, green scent. "From the mountains," she explained, taking a pinch of dried leaves. "Good medicine for pain." She began grinding the herbs between smooth river stones she'd gathered from the creek. "Watch," she told Christian. "Next time you do this yourself." Her movements were precise, practiced. When the leaves were powder, she added water from the bucket, creating a paste. "Now drink." The tea was bitter, but not unpleasant. Christian sipped slowly while Morning Star explained which plants to gather and when. Her voice was measured, teaching as her people had taught for generations. By the time the cup was empty, warmth spread through his shoulders, easing the worst of the ache. "Much obliged?" he said softly. "Reckon there's a heap of knowledge in these hills I've yet to learn." A rider appeared on the trail, kicking up dust. Christian tensed, but it was only Jimmy Wells, the young clerk from the reservation agency. He carried a leather dispatch pouch and a friendly wave. "Brought something you'll want to see," Jimmy called, dismounting. He was barely 20, eager to help despite his boss's disapproval. From his pouch, he drew out several official-looking papers. "Found these in the old files. Army records, land grant documents, everything about Morning Star's husband." They gathered around the rough table inside as Jimmy spread out the papers. There, in black ink, was the proof. Morning Star's husband had served faithfully as a scout, and the cabin land had been promised as payment. The documents bore official seals and signatures. "This here's ironclad," Jimmy explained. pointing to various stamps and dates. Legal right to the property clear as day. Burke and his bunch can't touch it, not without breaking federal law. Christian's face broke into a broad smile. Thank the Lord. He breathed. We've got them now. He turned to Morning Star, expecting to share in the triumph, but her expression remained guarded. Papers did not help before, she said quietly. White man's promises break like dry twigs. Jimmy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. Mom, I know there's been wrong done. But this time, it's different. Mr. Kincaid here, he's standing with you. And there's folks in town starting to come around, especially after Sunday's sermon. Morning Star said nothing, but her hand rested protectively on Clara's shoulder. The girl looked up at her mother, then at Christian, hope shining in her eyes. The sun was setting when Jimmy rode out, leaving the precious documents behind. Christian insisted on celebrating. He brought in fresh trout he'd caught that morning, and Morning Star added cornbread and wild greens to the meal, the cabin filled with warmth and cooking smells. They ate by lamplight, the children's chatter mixing with the crackle of the hearth fire. Daniel proudly showed off his blistered hands from fence mending. Clara taught Christian a Cheyenne word for family, laughing when he stumbled over the pronunciation. After supper, while Morning Star put the children to bed, Christian stepped outside. The night was clear, stars scattered like silver across the black sky. He stood listening to the wind in the pines, feeling more at peace than he had in years. Morning Star joined him silently. For a long while, they just stood, watching the stars wheel overhead. When I was younger, Christian finally said, his voice low, I wandered all over these territories. Never stayed anywhere long. Didn't believe in much of anything, least of all myself. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But lately, since finding that deed, meeting you and the children, I feel like maybe God's been leading me somewhere all along. Like maybe this is where I'm meant to be. He glanced at Morning Star. Her face was turned up to the stars, unreadable in the darkness. My people say the stars are spirits of ancestors, she said after a moment. They watch, they guide. She wrapped her shawl tighter. But they also see many broken promises. Many tears. I understand your doubt, Christian said gently, but I swear to you, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Morning Star's silence stretched out. In the cabin, Clara coughed softly in her sleep. A coyote called from the ridge, lonely and wild. My children smile now, Morning Star finally said. They build dreams here. She turned to face Christian, her eyes reflecting starlight. Dreams are dangerous things. They break, they hurt, but she didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. Christian saw the war within her, between hard-learned suspicion and the undeniable hope growing in her children's hearts. In her own heart too, perhaps. We'll take it day by day, he said softly. That's all anyone can do. Morning Star nodded once, then turned towards the cabin. At the door, she paused. Tomorrow I show you more herbs, she said, for strength. We will need it. Christian watched her disappear inside, then looked back to the stars. The night was deep and full of promise, like a story just beginning to unfold. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. For now it was enough to know they didn't face it alone. The cabin windows glowed warm against the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out across the sleeping valley. Christian smiled, touched his hat brim to the stars, and went inside to where lamplight and family waited. The October wind whistled through the pines as Christian hung the last shutter, testing its swing. Golden aspen leaves skittered across the swept yard, where Morning Star and Clara arranged jars of preserved wild berries on the porch steps. The cabin stood transformed, windows gleaming, roof solid, smoke curling from the stone chimney that Christian had carefully rebuilt. "Looks right fine now," Pastor Whitlow remarked, dismounting from his horse. He'd ridden up for the house blessing they'd planned, his Bible tucked securely in his saddlebag. "Hard to believe it's the same place?" Daniel ran out to take the pastor's horse, proud to show off the new hitching post he'd helped install. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Morning Star had scrubbed every surface until the wood shone, and fresh-cut pine boughs decorated the mantel. They gathered around the table, heads bowed as Pastor Whitlow offered thanks. The aroma of Morning Star's venison stew filled the warm air. Christian couldn't help but marvel at how natural it felt. All of them together, sharing bread and conversation as if they'd always been family. After the meal, Clara tugged at her mother's sleeve. "May I sing the song?" she asked shyly. Morning Star nodded, and the girl stood straighter, her clear voice rising pure and strong. The hymn began in English, the familiar words of "Amazing Grace" floating up to the rafters. Then, seamlessly, Clara shifted to Cheyenne, the ancient language lending new depth to the melody. Christian felt his throat tighten with emotion. He glanced at Morning Star and saw tears glinting in her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. Even Pastor Whitlow sat transfixed, his weathered face soft with wonder. "The Lord surely dwells in this place," the pastor said when Clara finished. "I've never heard a sweeter sound, nor seen a truer home." Outside in the gathering dusk, none of them noticed the rider concealed among the trees. He watched the scene through the windows, noting the laughter, the easy way Christian's hand rested near Morning Star's on the table. When the singing began, he wheeled his horse around and spurred hard for town, eager to report to Burke what he'd witnessed. But inside the cabin, peace reigned. Daniel helped clear the dishes while Christian stoked the fire. Morning Star's usual wariness had softened, if only for this evening, as she watched her children move confidently through the space that was finally, truly, theirs. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in pale gold when the thunder of hoofbeats shattered the morning quiet. Christian burst from the cabin door, his heart stopping at the sight of 6 mounted men charging up the trail. Badge-wearing deputies led the charge, rifles raised. "This here's a trespass situation," the lead deputy announced, his voice hard as iron. "Got orders to clear these squatters." Morning Star appeared in the doorway, Daniel and Clara clutching her skirts. "We have rights," she said firmly, holding up the deed. "This is our land." The deputies ignored her words. 2 men dismounted and grabbed her arms roughly. The children's screams pierced the air as other riders tore them away from their mother. "No!" Christian charged forward, his fists connecting with the nearest deputy's jaw. But more men swarmed him, boots and fists striking until he lay gasping in the dirt. Through swollen eyes, he watched them force Morning Star and the children into a wagon. The last deputy nailed boards across the cabin door, sealing away their home, their hope, their future. Christian could only watch helplessly as the wagons disappeared down the trail, the children's cries fading into distance. That night, he huddled by the creek, each breath stabbing through broken ribs. His prayers rose ragged and desperate into the darkness. "Lord, help us." 2 days crept by like molasses as Christian battled his injuries. Each breath sent daggers through his ribs, but worry for Morning Star and her children hurt worse than any bruise. He gritted his teeth and limped down Red Butte's dusty main street, leaning on a walking stick Pastor Whitlow had carved for him. At the jailhouse, he learned Morning Star was being held in a cramped cell. The children had been taken to the Thorn Ranch, Burke's closest allies. The thought of Daniel and Clara trapped there, scared and alone, made his chest tighten. "The Lord hasn't abandoned them," Pastor Whitlow said, gripping Christian's shoulder. "And neither shall we." Together they retrieved the chest from its hiding place. That night, by lamplight in the church study, Christian spread out the yellowed letters and Bible. His fingers traced the careful notes Morning Star's husband had written in the margins, passages about justice, promises kept, and land rightfully earned through honest service. "These words," Christian whispered, hope kindling in his heart. "They tell the true story. If the townspeople hear this testimony." Pastor Whitlow nodded. "Truth has power, son. The Lord's justice will prevail." For the first time since the attack, Christian felt his purpose steady and clear. This fight wasn't just about property, it was about doing what was right in God's eyes. The church bells rang clear across Red Butte that Sunday morning. Townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces tight with curiosity. Christian stood at the bottom of the church steps, his bruised ribs screaming with each breath. But determination burned brighter than pain. Pastor Whitlow nodded encouragement from the church doorway. Christian raised Morning Star's husband's Bible high, its leather worn smooth by faithful hands. The crowd hushed. "Good people of Red Butte." Christian's voice carried strong despite his injuries. "I hold here not just a Bible, but proof of a sacred promise broken." His fingers found the marked passages, the careful notes in the margins. These words tell the story of a brave man, Morning Star's husband. He rode scout for the United States Army, leading troops through dangerous territory. His knowledge saved countless soldiers' lives. Christian turned the pages slowly, letting truth sink deep. For this service, he was promised land, the very cabin I thought I bought for 50 cents. Burke shouldered through the crowd, face dark as a thunderhead. "That's enough of your lies, Kincaid." But Christian read on, his voice steady. Here in his own hand, "Today, Lieutenant Marshall promised the cabin plot as payment, a place for my children to grow safe." He looked up, meeting dozens of eyes. "Before God and all of you, I say denying this widow her rightful claim mocks both law and gospel." Townspeople shifted uncomfortably. Several nodded. A woman clutched her shawl tighter, whispering, "It ain't right, what's been done." Burke lunged forward, fists clenched. "Sheriff! Shut him up!" Christian turned to Sheriff Hale, who stood rigid by the jail door, their eyes locked in silent challenge. "Sheriff, will you uphold justice, or bow to power that corrupts it?" The square fell silent as death. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sheriff Hale's hand rested on his gun belt as he weighed years of bending to Burke's will against the truth ringing in Christian's words. Sheriff Hale drew a long breath, his weathered face softening. "Release her," he commanded, pulling the jail keys from his belt. "This woman's claim stands true." Morning Star emerged into the sunlight as her children broke free from their keepers, racing across the square. "Mama!" They collided with her in a tangle of tears and laughter. Clara's small hands clutched her mother's dress while Daniel pressed his face into her shoulder, their sobs of joy echoing across the suddenly quiet square. Burke's face twisted with rage. "You'll all regret this." He turned to his ranch allies, but they stepped back, heads bowed in shame. Even his most loyal hands refused to meet his gaze. Pastor Whitlow moved through the crowd to rest his hand on Christian's shoulder. "The Lord's justice speaks clear today," he declared, his voice carrying across the square. "Let none dispute it." Morning Star approached Christian, her eyes bright with tears. She took his hand in both of hers, squeezing tight. No words were needed. Burke spurred his horse hard, spraying dust as he fled. The crowd watched him go, then turned back to offer quiet words of support to Morning Star's family. That evening, Christian and Daniel pried the boards from the cabin door. Inside, Morningstar struck a match to the lamp, its warm glow welcoming them home at last. Soft flakes drifted past the cabin windows as December settled into the high country. Inside, the pot-belly stove radiated warmth while savory scents filled the snug room. Morningstar stirred a thick stew, adding pinches of her dried herbs that hung in bundles from the rafters. Near the hearth, Clara and Daniel played with wooden figures Christian had carved for them, their shadows dancing on the log walls. Christian knelt on the plank floor, his large hands steady as he hammered the final nail into the cradle he'd fashioned from pine boards. The wood gleamed golden in the lamplight, smoothed by hours of careful sanding. He ran his fingertips along the curved edge, remembering that spring day when 50 cents had bought him an empty cabin and a deed that changed everything. 50 cents bought me boards and nails, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. But God gave me a family. Morningstar moved quietly behind him, her hand settling warm and sure on his broad shoulder. Her smile, once so guarded, now held only tenderness. Together they bowed their heads as the children scrambled close. Their soft prayers rose above the howling wind. Thanks for justice restored, for shelter made holy by love, for the mercy that had drawn 4 lonely hearts into one home. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.